intellectually on a high level, then why to use this word in academia?
Okay. Yes. Anybody? Okay. Yes.
Okay. Suman Hajani from Hamdan bin Mohammed Smart University. And the benefits, the huge benefits of mobility. However, in order to make this program more successful, especially with the Arab world and all the challenges and maybe a little bit culture, maybe resistance in the Arab world, I think that we cannot ignore the huge benefits of technology at this stage. And I think we may open our mind to a little bit different kind of mobility. What I propose is a blended mobility, which has a part of a physical mobility and another part of a virtual mobility. I'm thinking to start with a virtual mobility, where all the learners will be able to engage with these universities abroad, and then we go back to the physical mobility and so on. This, I think, first will cut the travel and lodging cost, which is really a huge problem or a challenge, especially in some countries in the Arab world. And also it will ease the transition and the change and the cultural shock, especially if you are going to, if you like to encourage females from the Arab world and so on. And also, to be honest, we a little bit have some problem in research in the Arab world. We have many ideas, but most of these ideas have not been materialized into research and knowledge transfer. So this will also open the doors for dual research, dual degrees, especially for the postgraduate programs. And I'm saying that because we already have a very successful practice in Hamdan bin Mohammed Smart University in establish a consortium of universities for our PhD programs.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry, I want from Hamdan bin Mohammed Smart University. My suggestion is going to be actually part of, if I may, put a recommendation for such a conference. And maybe it involves Professor Arabi, the Secretary General, as well as the Secretary General from the European Association of Universities. My recommendation is, because of a successful thing that we have seen in the consortia, that why we don't put a framework, Professor Arabi, from this conference between the two associations, Arab universities as well as the European universities, for those universities and higher education institutions that they are willing to come for part of a consortia and to put kind of a common credit systems to be able to do it. It needs kind of a framework to be put forward, and the universities who are willing from both European and Arab universities will be joining this consortia. And we are ready to work on kind of a concept paper, if you'd like, Professor Arabi, along with other colleagues as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And so if there is a move for applying a credit hour system in the Arab world, it bridges many gaps actually, and it promotes recognition and accreditation of these universities. So it is a good suggestion to be taken forward.
I'm talking about the common credit system.
Yes.
Not the credit hours.
The credit system, yes.
A common credit system that Professor Gianni has already.
Oh, yes. So.
That the Bologna process is outside Europe, the EU, because it was launched by Ministry of Higher Education or Education from several countries, few countries at the very beginning, and it was really an exceptional procedure because actually higher education is at the limit of the competency of EU. So clearly it was started because several Ministry of Higher Education was really conscious about we need a joint system on this LND, but it was not something which is really organized by EU and planned and take time to discussion. So at this stage, to switch from to organize a joint system, You need some few people really aware about the need and really willing to progress in this area, and then starting something. Because it was really not something really planned for a long time, with a lot of discussion, it was just few people saying, okay, we need it, we propose something, and we try to impose it. The Bologna process is something really exceptional in the European, outside EU process realization.
Master's courses, where the bulk of it is done online, particularly around surgery and some of the more advanced courses here. And then there's a short visit to Edinburgh at some point in proceedings, if that's what the students want. So we do have some courses like that already, which I didn't have time to talk about. For joint PhDs, it's completely flexible according to the two sets of supervisors and the two universities. So some students will come for a year in the middle from one direction to the other. Sometimes it will be 2 years, sometimes it will be several shorter visits. It depends very, very much on the discipline, because different disciplines work in different ways. And so that particular, for a joint PhD, you can set it up in any way you like, as long as you deal with all the issues about visas and about students being able to move.
I mean the flexibility about the content of the program. Because you will give the PhD program for your country or for your university, and at the same time, if you give the PhD degree on the same subject as a joint program, is it possible to change the content completely according to the joint program?
You will do the talk components of it will depend upon when the student is where. So in the UK, most of our talk component will be things around skills training, how to present entrepreneurship, research methodology, perhaps in the humanities and social sciences. So it's very much dependent upon exactly what the student is doing. And that can all just be specified in the memorandum of agreement. So answer is total flexibility.
Presentation, and I'm very pleased to introduce the chairman of the session, Dr. Mohammed Lutfi, Magna Carta Council member. He's a Vice-chancellor at Cardiff Metropolitan University in the UK. Turn the podium to him.
Thank you, Mr. President. I know now we're with a session before the coffee break, but I promise you it's going to be a very interesting session. A very rich panel that I'm very proud to chair this panel. And the panel this panel will be about university leadership and the institutional impact of mobility, but from a leadership point of view, a rector's point of view, leadership point of view. So let's start by saying things like why do we mobilize? From a leadership perspective, preparing the global citizen, rounded graduates, fit for employment across the world, convergence, integration, soft diplomacy, and we've heard this, some people tapped on this in several previous sessions. Students and staff mobility are key in internationalization of any institution, in internationalizing the students and staff body, the curricula, the campuses. It's about also student satisfaction. Mobility is about student satisfaction. Through mobility, students and staff are enabled to broaden their global experience and understand the studies in a more global context. Yet, we're still not doing enough as leaders or as institutions. Industries are not happy with the levels of cultural awareness coming from our graduates. To give an example, the CDI, which is the Confederation of British Industries, reported a figure of 47% of British industries that are not happy with the level of cultural awareness of our graduates in the UK. Mobility also is a USP, unique selling point for employability, and some people mentioned this in previous sessions. This facilitates the gaining employment in a global marketplace and not merely looking for employment in their immediate locality. But how can we make our students mobile? How can we make them more competitive? What is the role of the university leaders in facilitating or encouraging them to be mobile? Mobility is not, however, without its challenges. With institutions now developing and implementing strategies in support of student and staff mobility and study abroad initiatives, many obstacles to mobility are looming and which we will tap on in this session. Some of them are financial, both in terms of organized mobility like Erasmus, Erasmus Mundus, or for free movers, it can be difficult for them to fund a study abroad. Some of them are language, and it's about confidence as well. Confidence of individuals' linguistic ability to be able to undertake a period of study abroad. Some of them are cultural. Cultural difference can impede mobility, as students would leave their comfort zone in their own countries. And this is something that is facing the UK students. Some of them are academic, and the previous session tapped on this about a credit system. First, it's about the problem of recognition, often lack of transparency of recognized arrangements from institution to institution. But this is not for within the region. It's more about inter-regional mobility that faces this problem, because instruments such as the Lisbon Recognition Convention do not apply. Secondly, it's about stereotyping from an academic point of view. Stereotyping and prejudice about the academic quality is a major obstacle. This is one of the main reasons for the current imbalance in mobility flows between East and West, North and South. In some cases, these perceptions might be true. Often, it is just the lack of information provided. So what is the role of our leaders, which we will hear from our panelists here today, to overcome these challenges? With increasing pressure from both national and regional levels to increase mobility, higher education institutions now and leaders are working towards the development of strategies, policies, and practices to enable them to adapt and respond to these demands. Within the context of the Bologna process in Europe, the target of reaching 20% of students with an abroad experience was set out. Some countries have exceeded this, like Germany, that reported 30% student mobility, and they're aiming for 50%. To meet the requirements of the national and regional policies, institutions are required to have a comprehensive internationalization strategy. And I stress on the word comprehensive internationalization strategy. Many institutions in Europe have an internationalization strategy that largely focuses on the mobility of students, focusing on inward mobility, mainly student recruitment, which can be considered one of the reasons of the imbalance that we're facing. Others integrate several initiatives of internationalization. So as well as student mobility, they integrate transnational education. We've heard the example of Edinburgh earlier and the TU Berlin. As well as student mobility, transnational education partnerships, EU-funded projects, internationalization of curricula, and we've heard several examples in the previous session about this as well. And they align this with their national policies and strategies. In this light, it became more and more important to look beyond the regional context and foster an inter-regional mobility. Schemes such as Erasmus Mundus are very successful, but only provide opportunities for a small number of students. It will be therefore the duty of institutions or nations to broaden the circle of students who could benefit from inter-regional mobility, and I know one of our panelists will talk about this today. The major questions here are, how can these programs be used in order to foster internationalization strategies? How can institutions integrate the experience gained through the participation in these programs in such a way that it has a wider effect on effect on institutional policies, practices on a micro, meso, and macro level? What are the signposts for institutions to implement a rigorous and successful strategy that goes way beyond the simple affirmation of mobility as a positive thing? It would be also noteworthy to establish a dialogue about how tools such as the European and national qualification framework, which was discussed in the last session, joint degrees, credit system, transcript of records, transparency instruments, could be used in an inter-regional context. And this is the role of leaders to be able to take this forward. All of this would not be possible if there is not an active exchange between institutional leaders in different regions. And at the end of this session, we will hear a short presentation about Arlene, Mr. Fathallah is going to give this, and Ali was mentioned yesterday. The Arab Regional Network of Leaders in Higher Education was mentioned yesterday in Professor AARU's speech. These and other further questions will be addressed by the panelists in the discussions, and I'd like to invite our first speaker. Our first speaker is Professor Juan Caracas. He's director of the University of Santiago de Compostela, and president of the Commission of Interrelationship in Spanish Rector Conference. To the podium, by the way, the University of Santiago de Compostela is one of the leading universities in Europe in attracting European funding, Erasmus Mundus and Erasmus. Please.
Good morning, everybody. Mr. Chairman of the panel. These days have been very special for me and for being here. Very grateful to the organizers to invite me to attend this meeting. I'll explain you rather quickly. On Monday, I finished my term as rector of the university, also as president, that I stood for a number of years at the University of Santiago de Compostela, and also my post as president of the internationalization committee of the Spanish universities. And at the same time, as it happened to be, 30 years ago, I left the Arab world to take a permanent post at the Spanish university after being assistant professor at what it was then UPM, and these days it's Kinfati, the University of Petroleum and Minerals. And therefore all happened over the last 2 days. So I really didn't take the right pen drive with me, and I found this morning that I had the wrong pen drive, but I'll try to explain as much as possible what are my thoughts about the where we go. And should I say that there's no return path from what happened over the last 20 years was the appearance of globalization, as has been mentioned, and also the accelerated growth of the knowledge economy. And that has put us, all universities, all the research universities in the world, under a lot of pressure to adapt to a new situation. We have talked a lot about, in Europe, what's been happening towards people, both students, faculty, staff, and non-teaching staff, and the efforts that's been made by the Commission. It was mentioned that, of course, education is the only item where the European Union cannot post directives, that is, commandments on individual countries. So everything has to do on the basis of recommendations. And the Bologna process was built up that way, and it's been for many countries, and certainly in Spain, a difficult path, and we're even adapting these days to. We have it already implemented, but really with great difficulties. I can't say it was an easy path through, and there's still many things to be done. Mainly because it was done at zero cost, so for public universities. As you probably know, we have 50 public universities in Spain and 30 private universities. 95% of the research is done by public universities, and private universities are mainly teaching higher education institutions. Let me say that we've been involved from the start in Erasmus, and now we lead Erasmus, both at sending and receiving students from the rest of the countries involved in Erasmus. We receive around 42,000 students, and we send around 41,000 students to other European countries. And therefore we've made a big effort that is somehow maintaining in spite of economic crisis. Because as you know, the money put forward for this stays abroad clearly doesn't cover all the costs. But everybody has realized something that was mentioned before, and I think it's very important. Now, employers really make a difference when they're choosing people to enter the companies on whether they've been abroad or they haven't been abroad within the Erasmus program. So there is a plus for all our graduates with respect to those who haven't been abroad. That also it's a problem because in spite of the fact that the European Union is willing to get 20% of the students moving at least 3 months along the studies, the university studies, to other country, by 2020 we're really far away from that figure, and it is going to be a difficult task to cover that 20% in the near future. And then again we have the 80%, so we have to do something about who haven't moved abroad, and we have to do something to bring in internationalization at home to cope with that situation. With respect to research, we're really based on Horizon 2020 for building up consortia to look for really important financing of what is becoming more and more costly research. And of course the European Research Council now takes an important path. We have around 26 Spaniards getting starting grants every year from the European Research Council to build up, that's a 5-year contract with 1.5 million euros involved. At the University of Santiago we have 4 starting grants. We have around 13 advanced grants, that's for senior faculty staff, and the European Union has 625 every year out of a starting and 250 for advanced grants. And certainly that's been the place really to get financing with respect to Europe, and I will talk a little bit about non-European countries' relationship. And I must say, entrepreneurship is the other word that stays out, and we built certainly a fairly large link with another part of the world that's so important for Spain, which is Latin America. And we have for a long time close relations with them, but these days the situation has evolved. Now they are the emerging countries, they got resources, financial resources, and they're so interested in capacity building by really sending over the people to, not to do whatever degrees on a bilateral agreement basis, but on government-oriented basis. And we have Science Without Borders from Brazil that are sending over the last 4 years, something like 80 to 100,000 students, half of them to the United States, but half of them to mainly Europe. And Ecuador, it's another of the countries with the promoters where they're hiring people from Europe and other countries to build up their capacity in their own country, and that is becoming more and more frequent these days with respect to Latin America. Clearly, we cannot talk about developing countries these days. We have to talk so much about emerging countries. We have also countries with that we have to look internationalization with them, but not expecting economic returns from that relationship, but really trying to reduce the gap that word globalization has introduced in the world of increasing the gap between those who have and those who don't have. And clearly, 2 minutes, yes. I will mention, as it was said, Erasmus Mundus has, the European Union has posed a possibility with non-European countries to enter in collaboration, both for postgraduate studies, mainly for degrees. And we have Erasmus, MSc Erasmus Mundus, we have PhD Erasmus Mundus, and we have non-teaching staff Erasmus Mundus involved. Well, not Erasmus Mundus, but Tempus projects. Sorry, I got confused right now. And certainly at Santiago Compostela, as was mentioned by the chairman, we made a big effort, and we now lead the number of Erasmus Mundus in Europe. Right now we are running 14 Erasmus Mundus, coordinating 4 of them. And we have now closed another 8 projects. It's not Erasmus Mundus anymore. It's called Erasmus Plus Key Action 2. And that's where we are setting our big efforts. And of course all this is involved in something that it proves so important over centuries for all of us that it's something we shouldn't lose contact with, which is diversity. And therefore, something that's become a barrier over the years, I think this possibility of cooperation will make things change in one sense. We all know that English is the lingua franca of research, but certainly all other languages, certainly Spanish, with 400 million people speaking Spanish over the world, will have their share of getting the chance to stay as a language of communication for all kinds of situations, for working, for living, and for learning. And certainly, I think internationalization, as I said at the beginning, is a no-return path, where we all try to look forward, seeing a possibility of economic return, and certainly if that is the way someone is seeing internationalization, I think it's a mistake. It's, as it was said also before here, it's the opportunity of cooperation and sharing. In a world where, okay, we have limits, those posed by intellectual property, those posed by the possibilities. I might say we have just finished an agreement, just finishing with this, we just finished an agreement by selling one of our spin-offs at Santiago with a Chinese university who's building up a plant, commercial plant to build one of the materials that we patented a few years ago. And therefore, possibilities of cooperation and sharing covers all the world. And as especially we are in Jordan and so close to Palestine, I must say that we have always tried to keep, and now we have 2 programs, 2 Erasmus Mundus programs, Peace and Peace 2 running, and we hope that some of the proposals we have made will become another chance of collaborating with Jordanian universities and Palestinian universities. Thanks.
And the balance, they got the balance right. 42,000 mobilities outwards and 41,000 mobility inwards. That's really amazing and interesting. Our next speaker is Professor Arnaud Renoir. He's the Vice President of Administrative Council and the Delegation of International Affairs, University of Paris Dauphine in France. University of Paris Dauphine is well known for its superiority or its world renown for the mathematics, management and finance programs. Please do.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. First, I'd like to say I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak here about a very difficult aspect when you are in charge of managing university is the impact of mobility on institutions. I've taken, because we normally have a very tight schedule, I've taken a very down-to-earth approach to this question. And I'd just like to present the case of Université Paris Dauphine, what exactly we have encountered in terms of impact. I'd like to stress before going into a more case type approach, I'd like to make a point very clear, is that the impact of mobility on your institution obviously will depend on the strategy or the vision that you have about mobility and internationalization. I'd like here also to say that, in my view, mobility and internationalization can be two different things. And this is going to be one of the first points that I would like to make in terms of strategy. Can be two different things in the sense that you can have mobility in a university that is not necessarily on an internationalization path. And I will try to point out how this comes out. I also believe that you cannot understand the impacts without having in mind the institutional context that you're in. The impact will be different depending, obviously, on where you are, what is the regulation that is applicable, etc. So if I take the context of Paris Dauphine, young university, founded in 1968, it's a French university, which obviously immediately brings a constraint. We teach in French. More than 44% of world student mobility is done in English-speaking language. And out of the rest, it usually goes to countries that might not be Anglophone, but where they teach English. So, first constraint that we have to take into account. It's focused on organization and decision sciences. We're not a comprehensive university. This obviously has an impact on mobility and on the organization. In terms of campus, I usually do not stress this out, but here, since we are in Jordan and it's the Europeans and the University Association that are together, I just wanted to mention that we're probably the only French university to have a branch campus, which is obviously not a traditional continental French approach, which is in Tunisia, and I'll be back on this in terms of impact. Complete managerial autonomy. Those who are familiar with the French approach to regulation can easily understand what this means. It just means that although we are a state university, because as I heard earlier, most countries are able to say we have that many state universities and that many private universities. Well, I'm very happy to say that in France we have something like 70 or 80 universities. They are all state universities. There is not one private university. They tried once in La Défense Business Center, but it actually didn't really work. So saying you have complete managerial autonomy is important because it will also have an impact on how you can actually address the issues linked to it. And finally, we're highly selective, and we can be tuition fees based. We're not necessarily, but we can be. That means that we can set the fees. This is also something important. In terms of vision and of strategy, the vision statement of Paris Dauphine is, and this will not come as a surprise, is to provide education of the highest quality. Who doesn't wish to do this in our fields? But the other element that's important, that's why I put it up there, is that we have decided to train students to face challenges, obviously, of today's world, and that means to be able to confront what we call the complexity of a globalized world. In other terms, also, to seize the opportunities that come in terms of employment or research in a globalized world. And I think this is very important because this is one of the mission and it's one of the objectives that we have set for us. And I would like to stress this out because coming back to what I said earlier, I do understand, and it has been said just before me, that internationalization is a no-return path, and I totally agree if you decide to take that path. My point here is that depending on your context, there are some institutions that might decide not to go and not take this path of internationalization. This might not be very politically correct, but I'll try to make my point even clearer. If I'm a university in a very large country with a large market, with a huge population, I can decide to stay local or at the side of the country. Now, this is true in terms of training, education, not in terms of research. Research today, whatever most fields, if not all, is international. But if you're just doing teaching, I might decide to have a local approach. So the choice of internationalization, obviously if I'm in a small country, is probably not one to be debated upon. If I want to be an actor, I have higher education, I have to go to internationalize. Having said this, and I have a few examples, for example, in the United States, where you have the highly reputed colleges that are not going into any type of internationalization, the ones that are not also engaged in research. They can have more mobility without internationalization. That was the point I wanted to make. And so the impact on their institution is not the same. Paris Dauphine has decided that it wanted to be a major global institution, meaning that it has to act on 3 pillars: students, faculty, and research. I will, of course, link myself to the mobility aspect, essentially the student. Also to say that we strongly believe in the local approach, the fact that we are working locally as well as globally. Or to be efficient locally, we have to be globalized. It's something common today, but I think it's important to acknowledge it. In terms of strategy, what this actually points to is that we have been looking into the globalization of the syllabus, what I call national internationalization. We have set a target, which is that 100% of our intake will have to have in the coming years an international exposure, whether mobility, whether internship, whether double degrees, joint degrees, etc. And that's during the 5 years of the master's. Looking into attracting foreign students, obviously attracting and recruiting international faculty, and engaging into international team-led research. I've said a few figures here also to give an idea of the scale. We are a small university, 10,000 altogether. 8,500 full-time students. The target is to go to 40 to 45% of internationalization in the period 2014-2019. We already have 50% of international PhD, but here the target is different, is that we want to internationalize it. As a French institution, among those 50% of international PhD students, we obviously have a large numbers of francophones coming from Northern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, mainly Northern Africa, because of the proximity also. So the idea is to maintain this level, but to diversify maybe the incoming cases. Executive education is also something that we're looking into. I will not comment much, but I think it's an important aspect to see because it is probably, we're talking about resources, it is probably something that enables institutions to go and find financial resources and they can internationalize their executive education. So having said this, and giving a general idea of the constraint of Paris Dauphine, what is the impact on an institution? We all know that it's a wild world out there. For those that remember Cat Stevens some years back, I was young, but still there. And if it is a wild west, and the idea is that the impact on the institution is, some of it is good, some of it seems pretty bad, and some of it is outright ugly. The good, the bad, and ugly, if you remember, you can download it freely on the internet. In terms of good, what we have seen in terms of impact on the institution, I think this is fundamental. It has brought planning, planification, looking into and defining your ambition, going into the strategy, looking into quality assessment, evaluation, looking at your processes, and it's overreaching. It takes up all of the elements of the university. The good aspect also of deciding this internationalization and the mobility, because if you're having hundreds of students coming from the rest of the world and sending your students outside, you really have to devise a global strategy and all the processes within the institution. So it has a cohesive approach also to it, or element, component. And it is a change driver. It is a very important change driver within the institution. What's less good and starting to be a bit bad is that the changes are overreaching. First, they impact everything in your institution, and you don't always easily plan in advance. More complexity comes with that, obviously. And something that is absolutely terrible, but which is a luxury also, is that you have to make choices. You have to decide. Having to decide in universities is not always easy. Now, it depends on your type of governance. But in the French tradition, it is always hard to impose changes on faculty. And the ugly is that, well, you have to implement the change. You can't just decide on the paper, you have to go through with it. And that can be difficult. You have to engage faculty and staff, I think is important, and the funding that comes with it, which is obviously an important aspect, and greater uncertainty. The issues, and this is just a very partial checklist of the impasse. What are the instructional language and the working languages? We have decided, for example, to create English tracks. That means you have to recruit professors that are able to go with those English tracks. We have to train our staff to speak English. We have to send emails, for example, to all our students that are both in French and English. This is a mini revolution in our context. Syllabus has to be looked into. The calendar, we changed the calendar of our institutions. Our minister was very, very happy. But you have to address this if you want to match a bit more the exchange aspect. Services, which is I think one of the most, and I'll end on this. The services is very, very important, and I'd just like to stress two aspects. You usually have a choice, depending on the institution, on decentralized or centralized models of dealing with mobility. Most universities, a few years back, had a mobility services or an international relations office. And some have moved away from that, saying that internationalization is within the institution. And so you do not need to have a centralization. Why not? Just that the cost of coordination becomes very high at that point, the larger the institution. So, at the same time, it is true that if you're going to internationalize, it means that you cannot say mobility is only addressed by a staff that only deals with that, and that's it. You have to diffuse it within the institution. And finally, the top-down to bottom-up approach. Well, I'll be a bit of a Jesuit here. It's a bit of both. The programs have to be bottom-up. But if you want to lead your institution into these changes, you need the top-down, and this is where the job I do comes actually in the sunlight. I'll stop right here in order to keep the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnaud. Very interesting presentation on a comprehensive view of internationalization in the university and the impact of it on the institution. Our third speaker is Professor Marwan Awatani, the president of Palestine Technical University, Palestine. And Professor Awatani is going to give us a different perspective from a university that is in Palestine and what are the challenges he's facing as a rector the different challenges he's facing as a rector for mobility.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I would like to talk about mobility from another angle. The virtues and challenges of mobility have been addressed by various speakers in different ways. And several examples of either joint degrees or research projects or student mobility were presented. I will not actually do that. We have the same thing more or less. So the particular angle I would like to talk about is, first, what are the institutional kind of requirements for creating an enabling environment for mobility? Because it is not a priori, it is not given that the institution is predisposed for that. Either because we have constraints within the university, or because the ministry imposes constraints on us as a state university. And this is not trivial, because there are, I can cite many examples where it is just difficult to deal with the challenges. For example, we had a very difficult discussion with the Ministry of Education regarding how they will accredit a joint degree with a European university, and especially sandwich programs, and some of them, you have to have a residence in one university for a certain duration. But how about if you spend 3 months in Belgium and 2 months in Spain and 4 months in Paris? Because oftentimes you have a joint degree. Other things are the calendar. They are very rigid calendars, and so in short, this is a non-trivial matter. I believe it requires advocacy, and maybe the Association of Arab Universities can kind of probably organize a roundtable, especially for government universities, on what are structural adjustments necessary to kind of lobby for with ministers of education or higher education, so that we're more conducive to internationalization and mobility. The other thing is institutional. Again, within the institution, we have certain limitations, of course. And you have financial limitations, you have logistical limitations, even legal limitations of how often a faculty member can travel and how long can he stay abroad. If you receive a visiting professor, and he teaches a course, how many weeks would that course be? Many details, many issues go under that. Now, so the first thing I would like to summarize is structural adjustments to make mobility more fruitful and more possible, especially for state universities. The second one is language. This is not trivial. I know that, well, more and more people are speaking English and maybe French eventually, but still, language is a limitation. And so what we have done in the university recently is kind of seed a language center. We created kind of planted a seed called the Modern Language Center, which would be English and French, to be able to raise the capacity of students and faculty to engage better internationally. So rigidity, I mean the key word that comes to mind is rigidity. Rigidity is the #1 enemy for globalization international. And I say this from my experience. I was the president of Quds University and now PTU. It's rigidity that is always in my face. You need to be more flexible to accommodate and to have a handshake with international partners in different ways again. So the second point is entrepreneurship and innovation. Now, we know that we have structured programs of Erasmus or Tempus. I mean, we have very, very clear roadmaps, activity, framework, and even KPIs, and you go through the process. The question is beyond that. What kind of spirit or mindset do you approach this kind of program, or a non-regular or non-structured program? I claim that mainstreaming a mindset of entrepreneurship and kind of openness within your faculty at large is fundamental. Because you send faculty to a conference somewhere, the question is, what does he do? Does he go and give a talk and come back and say, report, job done? Or does he actually optimize and leverage the opportunities there by being entrepreneurial in ways that can kind of create more opportunities and bring more harvest home? And that is again non-trivial. I'll give one example. The gentleman from Dauphine, we did not arrange a rendezvous. But it's quite interesting that we come back to that. In the late 90s, a president of a French university called Vice-chancellors, your university, is a mathematician, and I was doing some work together with him. He came to visit me in Palestine just to discuss mathematics. Right? He stayed for a week. We ended up, of course, it's a very interesting navigation process, with a new program in Birzeit University called Mathematical Economics with Dauphine. Way before Tempus and Erasmus, there was nothing there. And we actually created the program, we lobbied France and we got the money from the French government, and we sent about 20 Palestinian students to Dauphine to study them, right? Management, and new areas of strength. And we hosted annually 4 French professors for 5 years. Them, again, we have to remember it was, 2000, and the 2000, very difficult conditions, but yet we did it. And the program now is a multidisciplinary program, national, but hosted in Birzeit. And that was in a meeting with one, with an individual professor, but that's what we want to do with them, publish a paper or do more. I would like to cite another example in this title, but this is actually all indicative. The president of the Mathematical Association of America, a lady who is still today the chair of the board, Wabedis, is also a mathematician. and we were together in bed. She was visiting Palestine. We had a coffee at the YMCA in Jerusalem. I call it as Lyon. And we talked about things, and then we said, we suffer from, there's nothing. There's no government, there's occupation, universities are trying to do it on their own. There was nothing. Museum is hanging, floating, trying to close, open, half, open. And so we agreed to submit a proposal to the Karim Saeed Foundation together. Then again, that was in 1990, maybe one or something, before Oslo. So we submitted a proposal, and we got over 90 scholarships from the Karim Saeed Foundation to Palestine in IT and applied statistics. Most of the IT companies in Palestine today are owned by students who went to America under this program, which we invented. It was not Fulbright, Wallaham, Florishian, So again, it is the mindset. I'm sure that this is not unique to our time. So the third point is relationships. I claim that the most progress, and I'm exaggerating, that's fine, just for clarity, but the most interesting and lasting outcome of mobility is human relationships. These can be life-changing in different ways, and you establish relations that that do things. So it is really important that we foster those relationships, cultivate them, and grow them to become lasting links, and we leverage them to open even further opportunities to have multipliers later for our students and colleagues, and not to just have it eccentric or narcissistic to yourself. All right, so the issue in Palestine is, now people talk about mobility, they need mobility, we need it much more. Palestinians need mobility because they suffer so much from immobility. And I just want to give you a couple of examples. Now, one is, and that is beyond the minister and beyond the institution. It's the general context, If I want to invite people to come to Palestine, and this is, by the way, a very important note, just imagine yourself in a university where there are no one except local French people from that district. There's nothing else. In Palestine, universities suffer from being so homogeneous. So in Bethlehem or Jenin or Al-Quds or Hebron, the student population is there. It's mostly from from that district, a bit from other places in Palestine, but there are no international students. 4 or 5 studying Arabic, there's no one. I mean, or forget about the Arabic language programs in the summer. That doesn't matter, and that is not good because it deprives our students from the incredible, learning of exposure. And so and the reason is, if you want to come to Palestine, inward mobility, you need to have certain arrangements, but the most important bottleneck is you can stay only for 3 months. Well, the semester lasts for 4 months. And you don't know if you actually stay for 3 months, and if you leave to the bridge, will you come back? No one knows. So many people that I correspond with around the world, when they say come for sabbaticals, they decline. We have been struggling to get sabbaticals to Palestine, and I call upon you all to try to help in ways that I'm not aware of now, in which you can have more and more people visit Palestine and kind of enrich the learning environment by teaching and doing so in Palestine. Right? Now the other, the other thing is outward mobility. Outward mobility, we have no airport. We cannot travel. It's a very little thing, I mean mundane. We have no airport. Okay, what does that mean? It means that if you go to a 2-day conference in Spain, you need to spend 2 days on the bridge, going and coming. So a conference 2 days, you have an overhead for another 2 days. It's quite inconvenient. And the other restrictions on mobility in Palestine, sorry to keep hammering the point, is internal mobility. For many, many years, now it's a little different because of the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. Mobility has been a real issue, and that has contributed to, has had formative impact on the sector of higher education. Proliferation of universities, so each city had its own university, lack of collaboration, completely no ties with Gaza, no academic ties basically with Gaza, and that's all kind of difficult in different ways. Right, I'm finishing my view. Okay, so I have a couple of suggestions, and these are: one, the sabbatical issue. We're really quite eager to open up sabbaticals to Palestine. Summer schools in Palestine, where we have more flexibility, you know. And this is an open call. We will do what it takes to make this possible. I call upon, the Arab and local university presidents in this setting to consider a student version of what we're doing. Students are incredibly, very important, very energetic, and if you allow a student mobility program, which is kind of a spin-off of this, would be great. I suggest that we have a pan-Arab mobility initiative within the Arab states, and finally, I suggest that we have a core curriculum between Arab and European universities. It would be interesting to try to have one common course. One course we all teach in freshman. All universities subscribe, no one forces anyone, but we have a choice to actually teach. We have neighbors. It would be lovely to guarantee or to make sure that we have one common experience amongst all our students. I have actually drafted for some. The last one is the advisory. It is so difficult to benefit from international collaboration. Believe me, capacity is a limitation. So it would be lovely to establish an advisory within the Association of Arab Universities, an advisory to kind of offer consulting services free for universities who would like to kind of raise the bar and be able to leverage the possibilities. I love your suggestion that Sheikh Hamad University, I think the idea of blended mobility is fantastic. Hamdan, and go ahead with the framework to have our support for whatever it's worth.
Thank you, Professor Marwan. Very interesting point of view of different challenges that are facing the universities for mobility, and stressing on relationships and the importance of relationships. We discovered that we have a relationship with Dauphine University that goes a long time ago, and also we discovered that he knows my Vice-chancellor and my chair. He visited Cardiff sometime in the past. Our fourth speaker is Professor Yasser al-Shaykh. He's the director of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina Embassies of Knowledge. And I want to know what is the Embassies of Knowledge, so we'll see.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Yasser al-Shaykh. I'm delighted to be here today, back again in Jordan. I come from Cairo, and as Mr. Chairman have just said, but he didn't mention that. I come from Cairo University,